today. In order to dismantle and fathom the complexities of a medieval stone building, such as a cathedral, an abbey, or a monastic church, it's important to start right at the beginning, both architecturally and also historically. And the beginning for me is at the end of this causeway at Lindisfarne, Holy Island. Coming into a ruined monastic church like this can seem a very complicated business. To the untrained eye, this may just look like a pile of stones. But to a stonemason who knows these buildings from the inside out, it's like an open book of history waiting to be read. Before we look at that, we must orientate ourselves. It's very important in a medieval building. The great thing is that each church takes the same configuration. But once you've learnt it, it's the same for any church anywhere in Britain. We always start at the west end. We come in through the west doorway, down through the nave. This is where the congregation sits. And our progression takes us to the east end. To the left is the north transept, to the right the south. Transept is a word that means anything that crosses over. Now this configuration is based on a cross, and for a very good reason. So the west end is the doorway. It represents the feet of Christ on the cross. Coming down the nave, this represents his body. To the left and to the right, the transepts. They represent his outstretched arms. His head lies to the holiest part of the church, the east end, facing spiritually towards Jerusalem. Lindisfarne was the site of one of the most important early centres of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England. But what we see today dates from Norman times.
This is the second monastery then on Holy Island, very different indeed from the first, because this was just a daughter house of the big Benedictine monastery in Durham. Never anything more than just a daughter house.
Mm-hmm. And when does it date from? When does this church date from?
Well, we think that the church was built before the actual monastery, and people are inclined to put it in the first half of the 12th century. It's very obvious indeed when you look at the church buildings that it was built deliberately to be a miniature of the great big church in Durham.
How many monks were living here then?
Well, it looks very much as if the planners thought that it would be what you might call a basic Benedictine community of 12 monks and a prior. But our evidence is that they never quite reached those numbers. Maybe sometimes as many as 10, more likely 8 or 6, and then in the last desperate century, definitely down to just 2 or 3 monks living here.
And why was that such a desperate century?
They had a lot of bad luck, really. They were sited too close to the Scottish border, for one thing, and after the border wars started, about the year 1300, they lived in fear of Scottish attack. So some of their meagre resources had to go in fortifying part of the monastery. For instance, up there, on the west wall of the church, at the very top, you can see 2 crossbow loops, where crossbowmen would pick off any Scots that happened to come from that direction.
So what happened after the dissolution of the monasteries?
When the monks had gone, apparently they did take the stones from the monks' living quarters and take them out to that hill over there to build a castle. Because once the priory was closed, of course, there was no kind of fortification on the island, so the castle out there was staffed with soldiers to guard the harbour. We don't think that they actually pulled the priory church to pieces. They had quite a lot of respect for a church. Mm-hmm. But of course, the land itself and the property passed from hand to hand, and in the early 17th century, a certain Lord Walden leased it from the Crown. Now, he had the idea that he wanted to take all the lead and the bells from the priory church for some other building work that he had, and so in the year 1613, he loaded all that into a ship, and about a mile out to sea, it sank.
Oh.
With the loss of all hands. So far as we know, our lead and our bells are still out there, under the sea.
The first thing that strikes me about this church is the shape of the arches. When I talk about an open book waiting to be read, this is what I mean. If you see a round arch, it means it's a Norman Romanesque arch. It gives us a sort of rule of thumb guide that we can say straight away, that arch came with the Norman invasion. It stayed for about 100 years. This church is full of round arches, and one of the best in the church is up above the crossing over here. You can't fail to miss it. That arch has stood for almost 1,000 years, and what a testament to the stonemason's art of building. Also, if we look at each individual stone, it's got a pattern on it, and that zigzag pattern is called chevron. It's a French Norman word that came with that style of building with the Norman conquest. This zigzag chevron pattern work is something that reverberates and decorates the whole of this church. Later on at Durham Cathedral, we're going to see it in stark relief. Today though, what's left here? Well, it's almost just a ghostly outline. But it's enough to tell us that this, beyond any doubt, is a Norman Romanesque building. There are plenty of larger and more imposing monastic ruins than these, but here on Holy Island, the power lies in the story. It goes back much further than this priory, to the beginnings of Christianity in Britain, to the monks who arrived here from the Irish Isle of Iona, led by St. Aidan. But the character people most remember was his successor, St. Cuthbert. So why did Cuthbert become the great famous saint that he is?
I think for two reasons. The first is Bede. Bede, the monk of Wearmouth Jarrow, writing in the 8th century, writing his great history of England, saw Cuthbert as the point of that history. Because for Bede, Cuthbert exemplifies everything that is most admirable in the human search for God. Cuthbert was only a missionary in a very secondary sense, because Cuthbert was in the first place a man of prayer. So what lies at the heart of Cuthbert's life is the search for God in solitude. First here as prior, but then Lindisfarne wasn't remote enough for him. He moved to a little island just off Lindisfarne, but it was within sight of the priory and the brethren used to come and disturb him, so that wasn't good enough either. Cuthbert then moved out to what we call the inner farm, where he lived his life of solitude for many years. But Cuthbert was never forgotten. You'd have thought that living on some strange rock in the middle of the North Sea, he would have been. But neither his brethren nor the wider Christian Church of Northumbria ever forgot him. So in 687, Cuthbert became Bishop of Lindisfarne. He was actually bishop for only 2 years before he died. But in that time, he established himself as the true successor to Aidan. The second reason is perhaps more difficult, but it's clear that from quite soon after Cuthbert's death, people came to the church on this site in search of healing. Cuthbert's tomb became a great centre of healing. So presumably if this was the pilgrim's route coming down the side of the nave, then where we come to is almost certainly where the original tomb of St. Cuthbert was. Not, of course, in this church. This would have been the original resting place of Cuthbert before the Vikings ever came. And I think that the fact that Cuthbert was buried here and the fact that the monks came back gives this place an enduring quality of holiness. When the Vikings attacked Lindisfarne, the monks from here took the remains, the bones of St. Cuthbert, away with them. And they spent